Thank you so much, David. So interesting, so many questions and thoughts on this, but in the interest of time, we will just move right into our next presentation. We're very lucky to have Megan Hanacek join us tonight. She is a registered professional forester and a registered professional biologist. Her past experience includes serving as forest stewardship specialist with the Association of BC Forest Professionals and as managing director of Association of Professional Biology. These positions integrate with 20 years of forestry management in BC and have brought the benefits of, she's brought the benefits of her position to as CEO of the Private Forest Landowners Association, or what we call the PFLAs. And she will speak about the PFLA tonight. So over to you, Megan. And you can put your slide up. Slides
Perfect.
up.
I'm just trying to get it up right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Can everyone see that?
Coming.
It's coming.
Yeah.
It's loading.
It's good.
I'm on Northern Vancouver Island, so it's a little bit slow with our internet.
It'll come.
Yep, it's showing us up on my screen, so maybe just in the next couple of seconds here.
Yeah, we've got it. Yeah, and I can see your mouse. Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, at any point, if there's any breaking up of the audio, just let me know. So thank you for inviting me to present tonight. I am going to take a bit of a different tact, and thank you, David, for presenting all that data. My background, actually, I spent over a decade doing a lot of biogeoclimatic stratification. I had one of the biggest silviculture companies on the coast at one point for about 6 years, working on Crown land, and I do work on private forest lands now. But I do really appreciate David's perspectives in terms of nuance and us looking at the bigger holistic picture and how to actually incentivize people who can be involved in management, especially in light of climate change. So as mentioned by Mary Beth, I am a registered professional forester, and I'm also a registered professional biologist. So what that means as a forester is I'm held by a code of ethics. I have standards of practice. I have an educational background. And if I don't speak factually, I can be held accountable. And that's one thing I think we really grapple with dissemination of information around some of these topics lately is there can be skewing of data. And if it's incorrect, often those that may be presented aren't necessarily held accountable. The other thing that I thought might be of interest to the group too is I'm also an RPBio, which right now under the regulation means I have right to title, which is a little bit different than a forester. But what is happening? There was actually an OIC, an Order in Council passed, number 517 back in September. And by next September in British Columbia, RPBios will have right to practice. So reserve practice, which includes a reserve practice area around conservation and protection. So really anyone sort of talking about advice and expertise around these areas like CDF, by next September should be a registered member with a code of ethics, background, educational background, a standards of practice, and be bound by the regulator. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out by next fall. And that may be one reason why we're seeing a bit of a push right now. So I just want to give you a background on what is the Private Forest Landowners Association. So this is what I'm going to cover tonight, and then we can get into a bit of a discussion about maybe learnings that have happened within our managed forest lands that could apply. We're both private landowners. I imagine many of the attendees today are Class 1 residential owners. Private forest managed land, private managed forest land in BC is Class 7. So I'm just going to jump right into the presentation here. So British Columbia is a very unique jurisdiction, as many of us know, and if you've traveled around the world, you know, about 95% of the land base is designated Crown unceded territory in many places. And only 5% is private land. And when you break it down, only about 2% of all of the land, so just a little bit less than half of all the private land in BC has a forest cover on it. That's not to say that some of it may have had forest cover before, but many farmlands have had forest cover and they've been strictly converted over for ag land. So what we have in BC is about 2% of the provincial land base, about 2 million hectares has forest on it. And approximately about, so that's half of that, almost half of it, people have voluntarily taken their forest land and put it into Class 7, BC Assessment Class 7, voluntarily put it into this Class 7 with the understanding that they manage it for sustainable forestry. And they have a whole different act and regulations that they follow. And there is another 1 million hectares that sits outside of the Class 7. And PFLA is a big advocate to try to bring all the forested land into this designation as much as we can. There are limitations though. That being said, if you have a hectare, you wouldn't qualify for this class. So if you get a chance, if you're interested in this, most attendees today are probably Class 1 residential land owners, I would imagine, on the call today. Class 7 is managed forest land. There are 9 classes. Class 9 is agricultural land. So it's just kind of interesting to see how land designation works in different tax rates. So originally when this was put into place, members entered the program voluntarily if they had 25 hectares. And they were incentivized with a bit of a tax break. That is no longer the case. There's often not a tax break. So we have many members that are in this program that are also taking on the added burden of another set of regulations and an act. Anyways, so our managed forest land does represent significant employment throughout the province, mostly on southern Vancouver Island. Significant amount of economic activity and a significant amount of tax revenue for the province. One thing I will mention in the Gulf Islands, so we have about 30% of the unique members in the managed forest program are in the Gulf Islands, most of them in the southern Gulf Islands under Islands Trust. And it's about 9,000 hectares and less than 1% of that gets harvested a year. So there's also this whole media push that there's, we're going to lose everything very quickly. Within the managed forest program, that is not the case. There is a very low level of sustained harvest happening. One thing I did want to promote throughout this too is all the things David mentioned around climate change. I am a big proponent of incentivizing stakeholders, especially around private land, into how they can become active stewards of the piece of land that they have. And there are great examples from around the world on how to do this, and other examples where this has not worked, where the actual private land owners have been ostracized and pushed out of the process. And what you're trying to achieve in the end is not what ends up happening. So I'm a really big proponent of proper governance, involvement of stakeholders, including private landowners, and especially in light of climate change, to monitor what's actually happening in your forest piece or your piece of private land and to adapt to that. So, you're all familiar with the amount of droughts that we're getting in the coast. We are seeing an uptake in frequency, and then we're getting record rainfall events. And we've been seeing this further to the west. I live up on northern Vancouver Island, and going back to 2013, we were starting to see really big events like this. And unfortunately, we're going to continue to see from what we can see from the projections. And David had one up from Tongli Wang. He's a well-known specialist out of UBC, and I follow his stuff quite thoroughly. So I think, just trying to lock up areas and especially have them being managed by people who are not registered, regulated professionals is not my way of really trying to manage for values properly. So I'll just move on. So our organization, we've been around for quite some time, over 26 years, and we represent those managed forest landowners in Class 7 throughout British Columbia. So what is managed forest land? I've kind of covered this already, but you do need to have 25 hectares to enter the program. There have been talks in the past, like maybe other members have wanted to come in to do timber harvesting, but there is a scale and scope issue, 25 hectares. It has to be a certain productivity. So that is the cutoff, and that likely will say the cutoff 25 hectares. I don't see this as a presentation to try to incentivize class 1 owners to try to come over to our program, but I definitely think there are learnings that we've had in class 7 that can apply to class 1. So as I mentioned earlier too, we are governed by an act and regulations, and the members that qualify and write a management commitment and get accepted into the managed forest program, it's a voluntary entrance into it. And once they're into the program, they have to stay in the program for 15 years. And if they try to leave earlier, they are penalized with a difference in any taxes, if there are any. So there is a regulator, much like being a professional, I'm regulated by a body. There is a regulator mandated under the Act that regulates managed forest land. And there is a council that has 2 members appointed by the provincial government, 2 members voted by members, and 1 chair who's jointly appointed by the other 4 members. And it's the members of the managed forest program that are paying. They pay dues every year and they get audited at least every 5 years. And people will try to skew that as like, well, you're paying into the program. How is that independent? But they are fully independent. It's much like me paying dues into my regulator as a professional forester. And I also get peer reviews, and I'd be appropriately disciplined if I wasn't following the rules. So we'll move on from that. This gives a bit of a breakdown of who we are and how the Managed Forest Council relates to the managed forest land, and how PFLA relates to the managed forest members as well. So we are big advocates. We do build best management practices for our members. And that's the other thing that class 1 owners could also look to. And David, you mentioned GERT. It's a great resource in terms of best management practices. That could be incorporated with landowners in class 1 as well. We also have best management practices for class 7 for our members to follow when they're managing their land. Okay, and these are the other statutes that that are governing the managed forest lands, class 7. So, and often you'll see things in the media, they can get misconstrued. You'll see pictures of someone harvesting on one of the Southern Gulf Islands, maybe a 10-hectare block. All of those ones that have been in the newspapers over the last 2 years have not been in the managed forest program. It's usually a developer, and I'll just leave it at that. But there are a tremendous amount of statute, over 30 different pieces of statute, closer to 35, that govern managed forest lands and activities. So I guess the biggest message that I wanted to convey is I think it's a mistake to try to not incentivize private landowners in terms of managing for values, public values like CDF, and especially when it becomes a very binary discussion and not within the context of all the nuances like David presented. And I've done transboundary work as well on the Columbia River, and I really think that there's some things to be gained from thinking about transboundary management, especially when you look at the CDF. Where the majority of it is classified. It's classified differently than our BEC zoning in BC, but you can find the differences and lumping. It is still the same ecosystem. And I think there's gains to be had for having transboundary working groups working on these different ecosystems, or even things like spotted owl at the northern extent of its range, or where you have rivers that come up through BC and go back into Washington State, or the Nooksack, which we're seeing unfortunately with flooding right now, which is affecting British Columbia. So I'm willing to, if anyone has any questions after this presentation, I'm willing, feel free to reach out to me, and I will always be a strong proponent of having professionals, the people with the right education and expertise to actually manage for nuances. And even if the private landowners maybe aren't themselves designated, there's ways that we can help provide some resources for those private landowners, even if if they're not in the managed forest program. So these are all the benefits of having someone actively monitoring and managing, even if it doesn't mean a big timber harvest. Wildfire reduction. We've seen instances there, over on our Galliano Island, there is an issue with bylaws where some of our members under Section 21 couldn't have dwellings on their private forest land. And what we've seen as a negative with that is members are not there as often, so they're not as incentivized as much to be there actively managing for what we're seeing as an uptick in drought levels during the summer, fuel load building, wildfire risk, decrease in ecosystem function for habitat for all the different organisms that use those forests. So I will always be a proponent of active forest management. I can't say that enough, especially in light of climate change. The other thing too is our members often have 25 hectares or more, so there is more opportunity for recreational access, and many of our members do allow trail riding through their lands, or they allow access to get to other pieces of land. All of our members, if they do harvesting, are required by law to actively replant. And the beauty about private land is we have members that are looking at assisted migration with climate change, and they have a little bit more flexibility than what's currently happening with Crown land. And one of our members just won a climate change award for reclamation of a site, looking at planting different species and coordinating with UBC based on projections of where things are going. And then we protect other values. So there's members actively managing and tapping into best management practices and RPFs and RPBios to manage for public values that overlap private land. And I will say over at the Managed Forest Council, there's 2 RPFs that are on staff, and myself over at the PFLA, I'm an RPF and an RPBio. We have a really diverse board of directors that I feel is fairly representative of the land pieces around the province. And just the diversity, many of them are registered professionals as well. So we're always talking about how do we make things better? How do we always improve and manage? It's a really fine balance between economics, environmental, new science coming in, climate change. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. But, I think the big takeaway is we are a different class than class 1 members that are participating tonight, but we share the same vision in terms of incentivizing the private landowners. And there are some public values that do overlap our private lands, but I think there's a way to incentivize members and have them actively involved in the management, not try to just push through some governance model where the private landowners feel that they're not incentivized to actually, and they don't even feel that this is the right active management to do as well. So I'll leave it at that, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Megan. That, I when I first got into this, all the different categorizations of land. So to understand what a PMFL is, and, it's exempt from many things. And also, I think most important, that it is so well managed and by many professionals associated with that. So I was going to say, too, that there's questions. Please use the Q&A, and I see that Megan has already gotten some questions. So that is obviously being used. So thank you very much, Megan.